The midday heat hung over the small Texas town like a heavy blanket, the humidity and dust mixing into a suffocating haze. The townsfolk sought refuge under air conditioners, and Main Street lay still, a straight ribbon of asphalt shimmering under the sun. In the distance, a shiny black SUV appeared, its polished surface reflecting light like a mirage floating above the road. Officer Dale Carter sat in his patrol car, lazily sipping lukewarm coffee from a plastic cup. It had been a quiet day, no accidents, no violations, just the monotony of heat and silence. Suddenly, his radar beeped, and the speed on the screen flashed. 72 mph. The speed limit was 55. "Here we go," Dale muttered, setting his coffee down and switching on his patrol lights. He accelerated, confident that no one escaped the police in his town. A smirk crept across his face. Finally, a moment to break the day's monotony. The SUV showed no sign of slowing, but Dale kept close until it finally pulled over to the shoulder. He braked sharply and stepped out of his car, habitually adjusting his belt and hat. The vehicle sat motionless, almost as if waiting for him. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a tall man in a well-fitted dark blue suit. His posture was upright, his demeanor calm, and his every movement seemed deliberate. Dale didn't notice these details. His focus was on enforcing the law. "License and registration," Dale said with practiced sternness, avoiding eye contact. The process was mechanical. Request the documents, write the ticket, and move on. When the driver handed over his ID, Dale glanced at it. His hand trembled ever so slightly. General Marcus Langston. The name was unmistakable. Marcus Langston was a decorated war hero, widely respected for his leadership overseas. Dale's pulse quickened, but he kept his face stern. "You know you broke the law," he barked, his tone harsher than usual. "Speeding," Langston replied, tilting his head slightly. His voice was calm and measured, a tone Dale interpreted as arrogant. It wasn't the response Dale wanted. It felt dismissive. A flood of thoughts raced through his mind. Why is he so calm? Does he think he's above the law? Dale had always distrusted people like Langston. Wealthy, successful, untouchable. His own life had been marked by struggle, and he believed men like Langston couldn't possibly understand real hardship. "Put your hands on the car," Dale ordered sharply. Langston hesitated for a moment, then complied. His expression betrayed no emotion, but his composed demeanor only stoked Dale's anger. This was Dale's moment. A chance to assert control over someone he perceived as too confident, too untouchable. Dale moved closer, suddenly grabbing Langston's wrist and twisting it behind his back. The general flinched slightly but didn't resist. Instead, he turned his head to meet Dale's gaze, his eyes cold and impenetrable. "What's this about?" Langston asked evenly, his voice steady despite the discomfort. Dale didn't answer immediately. His grip tightened, and a surge of emotion boiled within him. Anger, frustration, and something deeper, fear. Langston's calmness felt like a challenge, as if he were silently exposing Dale's insecurities. "You think you're above the law, General?" Dale hissed, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and self-doubt. "Not here, not in my town." Langston's calm expression didn't falter. "I'm not resisting, officer. I've complied with everything you've asked." Dale's grip faltered for a split second. The man's calm demeanor was unnerving. For a moment, Dale wondered if he was losing control. Not of the situation, but of himself. Before Dale could escalate further, the sound of another patrol car approached. Officer Jane Matthews, Dale's partner, stepped out and immediately recognized Langston. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Dale," she said cautiously, "do you know who this is?" "I know exactly who he is," Dale snapped, his voice defensive. "Doesn't mean he gets to break the law." Jane's expression turned serious. "General Langston is a national hero. We need to handle this carefully." Langston remained silent, observing the exchange with the same unflinching calm. Jane's words seemed to cut through Dale's anger. Slowly, he released Langston's wrist and stepped back. "Apologies for the misunderstanding, General," Jane said, her tone respectful. "We'll handle this appropriately." Langston nodded, brushing off his sleeve. "Thank you, Officer Matthews. I trust you'll ensure the situation is resolved." As Langston returned to his SUV, Dale stood frozen, grappling with the weight of his actions. He had let personal frustrations cloud his judgment, and now the whole town would likely hear about it. Jane turned to Dale, her voice firm. "We're going to have a talk, back at the station." As the black SUV disappeared down the road, Dale couldn't help but feel the heat of shame creeping up his neck. This wasn't just a routine stop. It was a wake-up call. "Carter, that's enough," Matthews said firmly, gripping his arm tightly. His voice carried the authority of someone who wasn't asking, but telling. "Step back and think for a second. Do you hear yourself? You're letting your emotions cloud your judgment, and you're about to make a mistake you can't take back." Carter glared at Matthews, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, his anger barely contained. "He's not above the law," Carter snapped, his voice trembling with frustration. "I don't care if he's a general or the President of the United States." Matthews sighed, releasing Carter's arm but keeping his eyes locked on him. "Nobody said he's above the law," Matthews replied. "But this isn't about the law anymore. It's personal, and it shouldn't be." Carter hesitated, glancing back at General Langston, who remained calm and composed, his gaze steady. For a moment, Carter felt a pang of doubt, a flicker of uncertainty about his actions. "You need to step back, Carter," Matthews continued, his voice softer but no less firm. "Take a minute. Look at what's happening here. You're crossing a line, and it's not going to end the way you think." Carter's jaw clenched, but he didn't move. Langston, still restrained, finally spoke, his voice calm but with an undeniable weight. "Officer Carter, I've spent my life serving this country, protecting the freedoms we all hold dear, including yours. If you choose to ignore that, fine. But understand this, your actions reflect more about you than they do about me." The words hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a knife. Matthews stepped in again, this time addressing both men. "Let's calm this down. Carter, release him. We'll handle the speeding ticket and move on. There's no need to escalate this further." Carter exhaled sharply, his grip on the cuffs loosening, but his pride still holding him back. He looked at Matthews, then at Langston, and back again. The weight of the situation was pressing down on him, and for the first time, he seemed to understand that he was out of his depth. Slowly, reluctantly, Carter pulled the handcuffs away. Langston straightened, adjusting his suit but saying nothing further. His composure was unshaken, a silent testament to his character. Matthews stepped forward, breaking the silence. "General Langston, I sincerely apologize for the way this was handled. If there's anything we can do to make this right, please let us know." Langston nodded slightly, his expression softening just enough to show he appreciated the gesture. "Thank you, Lieutenant," he said. "I hope this serves as a learning moment for everyone involved." With that, Langston turned and walked calmly back to his SUV. He paused before getting in, looking back at Carter, his eyes meeting the officer's. There was no anger, no malice, just a quiet, unspoken challenge to do better. The sound of the SUV door closing broke the silence, and moments later, the vehicle disappeared down the road. Matthews turned to Carter, his face a mix of disappointment and frustration. "Carter," he began, his tone sharp but not unkind, "you need to think long and hard about what just happened. This isn't how we do things, not here, not anywhere. We're supposed to uphold the law, not twist it to suit our emotions." Carter didn't respond. His anger had ebbed, replaced by a gnawing sense of regret and shame. He looked down at the ground, unable to meet Matthews's gaze. "You're better than this," Matthews added before walking away, leaving Carter alone with his thoughts. As Carter stood there, the midday heat no longer felt like the biggest weight pressing on him. For the first time, he felt the full gravity of his actions and the long road he had ahead to make things right. Carter's gaze darted from Langston to the growing crowd, then to Matthews, whose phone was still trained on him. The journalist, now standing closer, continued filming, his camera catching every word and action. The weight of scrutiny bore down on Carter like an anvil, yet his pride refused to yield. Matthews stepped forward, his voice steady but commanding. "Carter, this is over. Let it go. You're not just jeopardizing your career, you're jeopardizing everything you stand for as an officer of the law." Carter's jaw tightened, his grip on his cuff still firm. "He broke the law," Carter muttered, though his words lacked conviction. His gaze shifted back to Langston, who stood calmly, unmoving, his posture unyielding and dignified. "Breaking the law doesn't mean breaking someone's rights," Langston said, his tone resolute yet devoid of hostility. "You have a duty to protect and serve, not to abuse your authority." The murmurs among the crowd grew louder. A woman's voice cut through the tension. "Why is he being treated like this? Isn't that man a veteran?" Another added, "This doesn't look right." Matthews turned toward the crowd. "Please, let us handle this," he said, raising a hand to calm the growing unrest. But it was clear the damage had already been done. Carter was losing not only control of the situation, but also the trust of those watching. "Carter," Matthews said again, this time softer, almost pleading. "You're out of line. Step back and let's de-escalate." Carter's shoulders sagged slightly as the reality of his actions began to sink in. His grip on the cuffs loosened, and he took a step back. His face was a mixture of anger, confusion, and something else, shame. Langston straightened his suit and looked Carter directly in the eyes. "You have a choice right now, Officer Carter. You can choose to do what's right, or you can let this moment define you for the worst." Carter's lips tightened, and for a moment it seemed he might double down. But then, with a heavy sigh, he lowered the cuffs and stepped away entirely. Matthews nodded, relief washing over his face. "Good. Now let's do this properly." He turned to Langston. "General Langston, I sincerely apologize for this situation. If you'd like, we can discuss this at the station, or you're free to file a formal complaint." Langston gave a small nod. "I'll be filing that complaint, Lieutenant, but I appreciate your professionalism. It's officers like you who remind me why I still believe in the system, despite moments like this." Matthews's face hardened as he glanced at Carter. "We'll make sure it's handled appropriately." The crowd slowly began to disperse as it became clear the confrontation was over. The journalist lowered his camera but lingered, clearly still observing. Carter stood in silence, his eyes on the ground, while Matthews and Langston exchanged a few final words. As Langston walked back to his SUV, Matthews approached Carter. "You need to think about what just happened, Carter," he said quietly. "This isn't who you are, or at least it shouldn't be. Take some time, reflect on this, because if this happens again, you won't just lose your badge, you'll lose yourself." Carter didn't respond, but the weight of Matthews's words hung heavy in the air. He watched as the SUV pulled away, the heat of the midday sun doing little to warm the chill settling over him. This was no longer about a speeding ticket or a simple stop. It was about accountability, about justice, and about understanding that wearing the badge meant more than enforcing the law. It meant upholding the values behind it. For Carter, the road to redemption would be long, but in that moment, as the crowd dispersed and the cameras turned off, he realized it was a road he had to walk. By commentators dissecting every moment of the incident, news outlets were quick to pick up the footage, labeling the encounter as a prime example of abuse of power. Phrases like "officer crosses the line" and "veteran targeted by law enforcement" scrolled across the bottom of every broadcast. Social media was ablaze with hashtags demanding accountability, and Carter's name was quickly trending, but not for the reasons he had ever imagined. At the station, Carter was summoned into the precinct captain's office. Captain Laura Hendricks, a no-nonsense leader in her mid-50s with decades of experience under her belt, didn't bother with pleasantries. She gestured for Carter to sit, her steely gaze locked on him. "Carter, what in the world were you thinking?" she demanded, her voice low but charged with restrained anger. "Do you have any idea what kind of damage you've just done? To yourself, to this department, to the trust we're supposed to uphold in this community?" Carter shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but the weight of her words held him down like an anchor. "Captain, Save it," Hendricks cut him off, raising a hand. "The video speaks for itself. I watched it, Carter. You escalated a situation that didn't need escalating. You targeted a man who served this country with distinction, and you did it in front of witnesses and cameras. What were you hoping to accomplish?" Carter hesitated, struggling to find the right words, but all he could muster was, "I..." Hendricks leaned forward, her hands clasped together on the desk. "A mistake? That's putting it lightly. Do you realize how lucky you are that General Langston didn't file a formal complaint? He could have demanded your badge on the spot, and frankly, I wouldn't have blamed him." She paused, letting the gravity of the situation sink in before continuing. "You're on administrative leave effective immediately. There will be a full internal investigation, and depending on the findings, you may face disciplinary action. Or worse." Carter nodded numbly, unable to look her in the eye. "Yes, ma'am." As he left the office, the walk through the precinct felt like a gauntlet. His colleagues avoided his gaze, their faces a mixture of disappointment and judgment. The camaraderie he once felt among them had evaporated, replaced with an uncomfortable silence that spoke volumes. When Carter returned home, he found his wife Karen sitting on the couch with the TV on. The news anchor's voice echoed through the room, replaying the now infamous footage. Karen's expression was a mix of disbelief and sadness. "Carter," she said softly, her tone heavy with emotion. "What were you thinking? This isn't the man I married. This isn't the man who wanted to make a difference." Carter sat down, burying his face in his hands. "I don't know, Karen. I let my anger get the best of me. I thought I was doing my job, but I lost control." Karen reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You need to figure out why, Carter. You need to make this right, not just for your career, but for yourself." The following days were a whirlwind of reflection and reckoning. The public backlash was unrelenting, but it forced Carter to confront the deep-seated biases and frustrations that had led him to that moment. He realized that being an officer wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about serving with integrity, respect, and fairness. Meanwhile, Matthew's video continued to gain traction, not just as evidence of Carter's misconduct, but also as a testament to the importance of accountability within law enforcement. Matthews himself became a voice for change, using the incident to advocate for better training and oversight. As for General Langston, he used the attention to highlight broader issues within the system, emphasizing the need for reform and mutual respect between officers and the communities they serve. His calm demeanor and principled stance turned him into a symbol of resilience and dignity, earning widespread admiration. For Carter, the journey ahead would be long and difficult. Whether he would ever return to his role as an officer remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. The man who had stood on that scorching Texas street was no longer the same. The weight of his actions and their consequences had reshaped him, forcing him to confront his flaws and strive to be better, not just for himself, but for the community he had sworn to protect. Change. Those words hit Carter harder than anything else Hendricks had said. A career change. The very thought was both terrifying and humiliating. Carter had devoted years of his life to the badge, pouring himself into the work, even when the system frustrated him. But now, with everything unraveling, he couldn't argue. Maybe he had gone too far, not just in this incident, but in how he approached the job altogether. Carter stood, nodding stiffly. "Yes, sir," he muttered, his voice barely audible. As he left Hendricks' office, the weight of everything felt crushing. He avoided eye contact with anyone in the station, their glances feeling like daggers. Outside, the midday sun seemed harsh and unforgiving. He walked to his car, feeling as though the world was closing in on him. When he got home, the silence was deafening. His wife Karen was waiting for him in the living room, her arms crossed and her expression a mix of worry and frustration. She had seen the news, of course. Everyone had. "Suspended?" she asked, her tone even but sharp. Carter nodded, sinking into the couch. "Yeah, it's bad, Karen. Worse than I thought." Karen sat beside him, her posture rigid. "Carter, you've always been so driven, but sometimes that drive blinds you. What were you thinking, going after someone like General Langston the way you did? Didn't you stop to think how it might look?" I thought I was doing my job," Carter replied, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. "I don't know, Karen. I lost control." Karen sighed, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've got to make this right. Apologize, own up to it. This isn't just about you, it's about how people see the badge you wear." Carter stared at the floor. He hated admitting it, but she was right. This wasn't just his mess. It was a stain on the entire department and everything he had once believed the uniform stood for. Later that evening, as he sat in his dimly lit kitchen, his phone buzzed with an unexpected call. The number was unfamiliar, but he answered anyway. "This is Carter," he said, his voice tired. "Officer Carter, this is General Langston," the calm, measured voice on the other end replied. Carter's heart raced. "General Langston," he began, but the words failed him. What could he possibly say to the man he had wronged so publicly? "I'm not calling to argue," Langston said, his tone steady. "I'm calling because I think you need to hear this. You've made a mistake, a big one. But mistakes don't have to define you. What matters is how you choose to respond." Carter swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I don't know how to fix this." Langston paused, then said, "Start by being honest. Take accountability for what you've done. Apologize, not just to me, but to the community. People respect humility, Officer Carter, and right now, that's what you need to show." For a moment, there was silence between them. Then Carter finally said, "Thank you, General. I'll think about it." "Don't just think about it," Langston replied. "Do it." The call ended, leaving Carter alone with his thoughts. For the first time, he felt the faintest glimmer of hope. He couldn't undo what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, he could start to make amends. The next morning, Carter drafted a formal apology. It wasn't easy to put his feelings into words, but as he wrote, he began to confront the biases and frustrations that had driven his actions. He submitted the apology to the department, and the road ahead wouldn't be easy. His career hung by a thread, and trust would take a long time to rebuild. But for the first time in days, Carter felt like he was taking a step in the right direction. It was just the beginning, but Carter sat in silence, the weight of the conversation with Matthews pressing down on him like a suffocating fog. The thought of every decision, every report, every arrest being scrutinized was more than he could bear. He thought about the times he had acted out of frustration, or let his biases guide his actions. What if those moments came back to haunt him? His mind raced, replaying incidents he had long buried in the back of his memory. A routine traffic stop that escalated because he let his temper flare. A questionable search where he pushed the limits of his authority. All those instances he had dismissed as minor or justifiable were now potential landmines waiting to explode under the microscope of an investigation. The room felt too small, the walls too close. Carter got up and paced, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He looked at the clock. It was late, but sleep was impossible. He knew the media storm was still raging, and he dreaded what the morning would bring. Each tick of the clock felt like a countdown to something inevitable and catastrophic. The ringing of his phone shattered the quiet again. This time, the name on the screen wasn't Matthews. It was Karen. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the answer button. He didn't want to hear her voice, full of disappointment and fear. But he also knew he couldn't avoid it forever. "Hello?" he finally answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Carter." Karen's voice was calm, but he could hear the tension beneath it. "We need to talk. The kids have been asking questions, and I don't know what to tell them." Carter closed his eyes, the thought of his children hearing about his mistakes making his chest tighten. "Tell them..." He paused, unsure of how to finish the sentence. "Tell them I made a mistake, but I'm going to fix it." Karen's sigh on the other end of the line was long and heavy. "I hope you mean that. This isn't just about you, Carter. It's about us. Our family, our future. You need to figure out how to make this right." After they hung up, Carter felt the sting of her words settle in. He knew Karen was right, but the path forward seemed impossible. Apologizing publicly felt like admitting guilt, and yet staying silent would only fuel the fire. He sat down at the table, staring at the blank screen of his laptop. Slowly, he opened it and began typing. The words came haltingly at first, but soon they flowed. He wrote an apology, not a justification, not an excuse, but a genuine acknowledgement of his actions and the harm they had caused. He admitted to overstepping, to letting his emotions cloud his judgment, and to failing to uphold the principles he had sworn to protect. When he finished, he read the letter aloud to himself. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. For the first time in days, he felt a small sliver of clarity, like a beam of light cutting through the storm clouds that had surrounded him. He hesitated before hitting send, knowing that once the statement was out, there would be no taking it back. But he also knew that avoiding accountability wasn't an option anymore. With a deep breath, he clicked the button. The next morning, Carter's apology was front and center on the local news websites and social media feeds. The reaction was mixed. Some people commended his willingness to take responsibility, while others dismissed it as too little, too late. But one comment, buried among hundreds, caught his eye. It's a start. It wasn't redemption, but it was a beginning. Carter knew he had a long road ahead to rebuild not just his career, but also the trust he had broken. For now, though, he resolved to take it one step at a time. There was no going back, but maybe, just maybe, there was still a way forward. He pulled up slowly in front of his house. For a moment, Carter's heart sank further. He assumed it was another reporter or perhaps another investigator coming to question him. But as the car door opened, a familiar figure stepped out, Jane Matthews. Carter didn't know whether to feel relieved or anxious. Matthews had been his only real ally during this ordeal, though even their relationship had strained under the weight of the incident. Matthews walked up the driveway, his expression serious but not unkind, and knocked on the door. Carter opened it without hesitation, stepping aside to let him in. "Carter," Matthews said with a nod, "we need to talk." Carter motioned toward the couch, and the two men sat down in the dimly lit living room. Carter didn't bother turning on any lights. The weight of the conversation they were about to have seemed fitting for the gloom. "I just came from the station," Matthews began, his voice steady but carrying a hint of concern. "The investigation is moving fast. The higher-ups are determined to make an example out of this, and you're at the center of it." Carter nodded silently, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I know," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "It's all over the news. Everyone's already decided I'm guilty." Matthews leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Listen, Carter. This isn't just about public perception or the media frenzy. They're looking into your entire career, every complaint, every incident. If there's anything you haven't told me, now's the time." Carter felt a lump in his throat. "I've made mistakes, Matthews," he admitted, his voice trembling. "But I never thought it would come to this." Matthews sighed deeply, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I'm not here to judge you, but you have to face this head-on. Running from it won't fix anything." "What am I supposed to do?" Carter asked, his voice cracking with desperation. "They've already made up their minds. Langston's a hero, and I'm just the villain in this story." Matthews straightened up, his expression firm. "You have to own up to what you've done, Carter. The system's flawed, yeah, but you contributed to that flaw. You need to take responsibility, not just for yourself, but for the people you've wronged. And maybe, just maybe, you can start to make amends." Carter stared at his friend, the weight of those words sinking in. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of clarity amidst the chaos. "How do I even begin to fix this?" he asked, his voice filled with doubt. "Start with an apology," Matthews replied. "A real one, not a PR statement, but something genuine. Talk to the community, admit your mistakes, and show them you're willing to change. It won't erase what happened, but it's a step in the right direction." Carter nodded slowly, the idea both terrifying and oddly liberating. He had spent so long trying to maintain control, to hold on to the image of authority, that he had forgotten the power of humility. "All right," he said finally. "I'll do it." Matthews placed a hand on Carter's shoulder. "It won't be easy, but it's the right thing to do. And, who knows, maybe it'll start a conversation that goes beyond just you." As Matthews left, Carter stood by the window, watching him drive away. The street outside was quiet, but the world beyond it was anything but. Taking a deep breath, Carter turned back to the living room, sat down at his desk, and began drafting a letter. It was the hardest thing he had ever written. Each word felt like a confession, a piece of himself laid bare. But as the letter took shape, so did a sense of resolve. Carter knew this was only the beginning, but for the first time, he felt ready to face the consequences and take the first step toward making things right. And now, all that was left was the choice of how to move forward. He could continue to run from the consequences, or he could face them head-on, acknowledging the damage he had caused. Carter opened his eyes, the weight of his mistakes settling on him fully, and decided it was time to take responsibility. The story of Officer Carter is a powerful reminder about the importance of self-awareness, accountability, and humility in all aspects of life. It highlights how unchecked biases and impulsive decisions can spiral into irreversible consequences. Relating this to daily life, it's essential to recognize the power of our actions and the impact they have on others. Whether in professional or personal settings, taking a step back to evaluate situations objectively can prevent misunderstandings and conflicts. The story also emphasizes the value of integrity and the courage to admit when you're wrong. Mistakes are inevitable, but how we handle them defines our character. In your life, consider approaching challenges with empathy and open-mindedness, especially when interacting with others who may be different from you. Practicing patience, self-reflection, and accountability can help build stronger relationships and a more harmonious environment. Let this serve as a reminder that growth often comes from recognizing and correcting our faults, and that every choice we make contributes to the narrative of our own story.